Добрый день, уважаемые участники конференции.
Good morning, dear participants. We are happy to welcome you at today's sessions. Today is the second day of our conference, and we wish both you and ourselves productive work. The topic for today's conference is the assessment of needs of children with disabilities as basis for social, pedagogical, correctional support of children with disabilities. The thing is that this topic is very multisectoral because this is the assessment not only of psychological and pedagogical needs, but also of social needs that are related. We have mentioned children, categories of children with special education needs, and needs can be very, very different, and needs can be based on psychological, social, economic, and other reasons. And today we will be looking at this matter from the point of view of limited vital functions and how it impacts the pedagogical process and the correctional and developmental training. So today we will hear very different presentations, and the topic of the conference now is equally important for both health workers and education workers. So the first floor goes to Aliya Kasımkhanovna Yersarina, who is the chair of Diagnostics Department of the National Research Center for Development of Special and Inclusive Education. She's a candidate of psychological sciences. Her topic is assessment of special education needs of children as basis for the organization and development of inclusive education in Kazakhstan. Good morning, dear participants. My talk today is dedicated to the assessment of needs, of educational needs for children with disabilities in Kazakhstan. It is well known that in majority of countries, inclusive education is being developed based on the social and pedagogical model. And this model is drastically different from the medical model that Kazakhstan has been using until recently. Allow me to focus on the main differences of the medical and socio-pedagogical model. In the medical model, the problems and difficulties of learning are inherent in the child before he is and therefore this child is abnormal, defective, or disabled. Therefore, he has difficulties learning. From the socio-pedagogical model standpoint, various disorders are seen as cultural differences, same as religious or cultural or racial differences. And the problem is not that the child has a disorder. The problem is that the society creates barriers and the school is not up to satisfying the educational needs of such children. Medical model needs assessment is focused on identifying deficiencies, defects, and abnormalities, and is reflected as medical diagnosis. And the assessment in socio-pedagogical model focuses on determining the educational needs of the child. This increases the role of psychological and pedagogical diagnostics of learning and difficulties. And indeed, if we look at what causes difficulties, such pedagogical report on hearing or activity regulation, which can be both in a child with ADHD or with autistic disorder child, but it is such an approach both that allows both for teachers and specialists to find ways to teach, methods or approaches to teach. If a child has a diagnosis, then in the medical model, the child is sent to a specialized institution where his disorders are corrected. In socio-pedagogical model, such a child is trained in a mainstream school, but environment in that mainstream school is adjusted to provide conditions for the child's learning. The socio-pedagogical model at this point in Kazakhstan has been declared in our regulations. Thus, in the State Program for Development of Education for 2020-2025, it is declared that psychological, medical, and pedagogical consultations will move from medical to pedagogical model. But the main articles of movement from medical to pedagogical model has been reflected on amendments and additions to certain legislative acts of the Republic of Kazakhstan on inclusive education. We should say that the implementation of any law is provided through by laws, and at this point in time, the Ministry of Education and Science is in the process of procedure of reviewing the following bylaws. These include rules for the assessment of special education needs, rules of psychological and pedagogical support in educational institutions, standard rules for the activities of organizations of preschool and secondary education, and standard rules for the activities of psychological, medical, and pedagogical consultations, which provide for the movement towards the socio-pedagogical model. Let me briefly focus on the terminology because they reflect change in the understanding. So special educational needs is one of these terms. Previously, we used to say that these needs were based on a medical diagnosis. But now we are saying about needs that that lead to education, that lead to learning conditions. And the assessment of special educational needs is aimed at determining and creating special conditions for learning. This is in socio-pedagogical needs. At this point, we single out three groups of children with special education needs. Group one is children with disabilities. You know the eight subcategories, the seven subcategories of group one. Group two are specific children with difficulties acquiring certain skills or learning certain subjects, for example, writing, reading, or counting, and children with behavioral or emotional problems. For example, children with ADHD, mild autism spectrum disorders, also who are exposed to unfavorable psychological factors, and the third and group three with special educational needs caused by linguistic, social, and pedagogical factors. This includes disadvantaged children, economically and socially disadvantaged children. These includes children of migrant families, of refugee families, and other migrants who experience difficulty adapting to local community. Also, children who don't have a mastery of the language of instruction. And second group is not children with disabilities, and group three, they're not children with disabilities, but it is these groups that have special education needs, especially now after Kazakhstan has been on online learning. These two groups make up the majority of children who are backward in their learning. So there is a definition of special education conditions. These conditions include not only training or special training programs, but it is also developmental programs, pedagogical support programs, and correctional and developmental programs. Various teaching methods, technical and other ancillary equipment, environment, vital environment, medical, and other services that without which appropriate learning of children with special educational needs is impossible. For the first time, we see the psychological pedagogical support term being used. So, and this is based also on the assessment of educational needs. So these are the terms and definitions. Such terms allow medical consultations and mainstream schools to focus not on diagnosis but on the assessment of educational needs and creating conditions for learning. And the assessment of needs, as it were, launches the mechanism for the support of children with special educational needs in a mainstream school. And so how does this mechanism or order of assessment of educational needs is provided by the new regulations? The first level of need assessment and student support at school, the first is So it is school, and the first person providing this assessment is the class teacher. All children are accepted into school. We have cancelled the norm saying that disabled children can be accepted into school only based on a special committee report. All children are accepted. Of course, children with disabilities that were identified at an early age, who received correctional assistance, they of course have a recommendation, and the school already knows about them. But we also know that there are many children coming to school, and it is only during the first classes, the first activities, that first difficulties are identified. These first difficulties are identified by the teacher. Unfortunately, in our culture, when a teacher sees something wrong with the child, the teacher refers the child to the pedagogical, psychological, and medical committee. So the teacher should, according to the revised regulations, all teachers provide educational needs assessment, and the teachers now can provide their own support and provide individualized teaching. And it is only if the teacher's support is not effective and the child retains difficulty learning, it is only in this case that the child is sent to the pedagogical, medical, and psychological team. And it is here that the social psychologist and other specialists provide their assessment, and this is the second tier of assessment. And then this team makes a decision. The support service after the support team or medical pedagogical team decide that they can cope with the child on their own by working out a program and other measures, including joint measures with the teacher, or if they decide that the child does have a serious set of problems due to very special conditions, due to special needs. So, and the third level of needs assessment is provided by the psychological, medical, and pedagogical consultations. The consultation is refocusing from medical model to socio-pedagogical model, with the focus on assessment of needs, with the aim to provide better learning conditions. And previously, our main aims included diagnosing, referring children to special organizations based on the diagnosis. Now, our focus is determining educational needs, consulting the family and the teacher, and providing appropriate consultation on special conditions, on training or learning program, and on coordination, various services, social, medical, and correctional. So what special education needs are identified by the PMPK, the consultation, pedagogical, medical, and psychological. So this includes correction of learning programs. The program can be abridged, or it can be individualized appropriately if the program change changes, the performance assessment changes as well. And if a child is using their own program, they have the right for positive performance assessment. So PMPK also selects the form of education, the textbooks, the program, the form of education. The child can learn in a specialized class. The parents take their own decision where they want their child to be taught. But if the child is taught on an individualized program or has serious behavioral problems, they are taught in the cabinet, in the room of psychological pedagogical support and other, and for some subjects, and other subjects are taught in mainstream class, creating the learning environment. So we have state standards for the learning process of such children, but the specific physical needs are assessed separately. Assistance from an assistant teacher, and in the rules of assessment of special educational needs, we see clear indications what children need specific specialists' services. And last 10th is the assistance of social pedagogue. Going on. The PMPK report will also be based on the socio-pedagogical model. All our statistics also reflects socio-pedagogical model. We don't count children's diagnosis, we count children with special needs. And the last one, you see the differences in PMPK report based on medical model and that based on the social model. And the latter one uses the pedagogical and psychological language, but most importantly, based on that, they provide broad recommendations on how to detailed recommendations on how to create conditions for children with special education needs. Thank you.
It is true that what you have spoken about are ways of putting into practice of those norms that are contained in the law of 26th of June of making amendments and additions to certain legal acts having to do with inclusive education. And of course, I've already mentioned in the welcoming speech as well that this is some serious work that we still have ahead of us to put all of that into practice, all of the legal acts, and of course the further training to follow, so that all of the practical services and the practitioners in the field understand it and are able to put into practice what's in the law. And next up, I'd like to pass the floor to Matthew Harrison. He's an experienced educator from the University of Melbourne Graduate School of Education. He's a researcher and digital creator of technologies to enhance social learning and inclusion from Melbourne, Australia. The topic of his presentation is practices for planning, supports, and interventions for learners with disabilities and neurological differences in case studies from the Australian context. Please, Matthew, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I'll just check, can you...
Recording in progress.
I think everyone can see my slides. Hello, my name is Dr. Matthew Harrison. I'm a senior lecturer in learning intervention for the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. Thank you for having me today. Today, I'm going to speak about practices for planning, supports, and interventions for learners with disabilities and neurological differences. We're going to be looking at a number of case studies from the Australian context. I'd like to begin just by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land and waters of Australia and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. This is really important in the Australian context, as we like to acknowledge the fact that we are on Indigenous land that was never ceded. This space also may contain voices, images, names of deceased people in photographs, film or printed material. So hello, I'd like to begin by introducing myself. My background is as a teacher. I've worked in foundation or first year of schooling in Australia, and I've taught right through to high school and tertiary or higher education. I've also worked in the United Kingdom and South Korea, which has been a really exciting experience for me. I've had a chance to see a lot of different types of schools and work in a lot of different school systems. I've worked in both mainstream schools and specialised special education settings. This means schools where students with disabilities and neurological differences attend school with other students who don't have these labels, but also have been to schools that have students with disabilities and sometimes quite challenging behaviours. I'm currently a senior lecturer and researcher at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education. This is at the University of Melbourne. It's a teacher training school. I work with teachers who are already teachers in schools who have come back to do their special education qualification. I'm also a co-founder of Next Level Social Skills, which is a program for helping autistic children and children with a diagnosis of ADHD to be able to build their social capabilities, to build leadership skills, and to be able to advocate for their educational needs. Today, I just want to briefly introduce my context, talk about what we mean by inclusion and inclusive education, and then I'm going to speak a little bit about response to intervention. This is an idea of determining who requires what type of intervention. And when I say intervention, what I'm referring to is the idea of giving supports or strategies we can use to be able to help all students learn. Then I want to briefly touch on the clinical teaching cycle. This is a process for planning, implementing and evaluating an intervention. Then I want to look at specialised assessment instruments to help us to identify what students are ready to learn and where to next with their learning journey. Then I'm going to show you 3 examples of intervention strategies in action. These are things that we can go and do to help these students in our classrooms today and tomorrow. We're going to look at video modelling, peer-mediated intervention, and instruction and game design. Just to give you some context, I'm located in Melbourne, which is within the state of Victoria in Australia. We're the coldest part of Australia, or one of the colder parts at least. We're right on the southeast coast of Australia. The Melbourne Graduate School of Education works with experienced teachers as well as providing initial teacher education. The University of Melbourne is Australia's second oldest university. I'm very lucky to work on a beautiful campus. Unfortunately, at the moment, we're locked down. We're all working from home due to the global COVID pandemic, but usually our school will have about 1,000 teacher students coming through at a time every year, right across all our programs. Now, this is a photo of my special development school where I worked at before I was at the University of Melbourne. So this is a school for children with complex needs arising from disability or neurological differences. These are students with very high support needs, typically denoted by IQ. These are students with IQs of 50 or below. I think IQ is a bit problematic in terms of a measure, but the students that I worked with had many, many talents and were funny and had their own personalities that they brought into my classroom every day. And I really loved talking about them and sharing my experiences of teaching with them with other teachers around the world. I learned so much from working with these students, as I'm sure teachers in Kazakhstan are also learn from their students as well. To give you some context, within Victoria, my state within Australia, about 15% of students have been identified as students who need additional assistance through what's known as a reasonable educational adjustment. This is changing something in the classroom context or the school to be able to make sure these students can access academic learning and social learning. This is, at the end of the day, what we want our students to be able to do is to be safe, to be happy, and to be learning. And I think right around the world, that's what teachers want. About 4 out of every 15 students who have been identified within as having an additional need receive targeted funding. So that means that the other 11 students out of 15 do not receive extra funding. So we do need to find ways to be cost effective to make sure that our resources are spread in a way that helps as many students as possible. When we're talking about inclusive education, we're talking about systemic change so that all students can access learning. So in the Australian context, historically, we had a system that excluded learners with disabilities and neurological differences until about the 1970s. In the 1970s, we began to set up special schools for those students to be able to bring them in so that they could actually access a high quality education and to be able to show that these students can actually learn and then go on to be thriving citizens. Over the years, more and more students have joined mainstream school. What we're seeing in Australia is what we're seeing in many Australian classrooms now are students with disabilities and differences learning alongside their peers, but we still have a large number of students with complex disabilities in special schools. So in my state, in Victoria, 47% of students with disabilities attend a special school. That's where we're at right now. When we're thinking about how we work with these students, we really want to make sure we're using evidence-based practices. This means drawing on research evidence. These are large-scale studies that say what worked for most children most of the time, examining under what conditions has an intervention been tested and been found to be really effective, and then thinking about what could be the side effects of a teacher's intervention strategy. But evidence-based practice is more than just looking at research. It's actually drawing on our professional expertise. As teachers, we know the best things, what is best for often for our students and the local context. We also understand as teachers what are the barriers to implementing evidence-based research-based interventions in our school. What could be the things like financial supports that could impact upon whether these interventions are effective or not? To ensure the interventions that are being suggested through research are going to work in your setting, we also want to draw on the lived experiences of our students. We need stakeholder voice. This is the idea of asking the child, asking the family, what are your needs? What are your values? And what are your preferences for your child? This would ask the parent. We want to draw on all three sources of evidence: research evidence, professional expertise, and stakeholder voice. That's evidence-based practice. So when we're thinking about how as a school system we're going to plan and monitor and implement supports, we need to think about the systems and frameworks we're going to use. So I'm going to examine some of these systems and frameworks now. The first of these is the response to intervention model. This is a really effective way of planning which students need to get which additional resources of support in your classroom. All students begin at tier 1. This is the universal tier, and this is for all children. This is the idea that we're going to use evidence-based teaching and strategies for all children to try and prevent the need for students to need additional assistance. This will save resources in terms of time and money and reduce the number of students who need to get targeted or intensive supports. Now, while evidence-based universal teaching strategies are effective for about 80% of the students, we know that as a certain group of students will often require specialised intensive support. This is the idea that we need to make sure that there's available support in terms of small groups for intensive support to be able to help students to develop the skills and to be able to decode text and to be able to get those foundational numeracy skills and to develop vocabulary. And this means that these students will require additional support from specialised staff. These could be teachers or these could be allied health professionals. We also know that this is going to change from subject to subject. Some students will need additional help in mathematics, some students will need additional help in literacy, some students will need help in history and geography, but we want to make sure that we're using data to inform our decision making. We also know that even though we can provide small group tier 2 support, we often are going to have a small number of students who will need a high level of intensive one-to-one support. And these are tier 3 students. What is really important is that we want students to go back to the universal tier. We want our intervention strategies to be effective and to be able to get our students, when they go from tier 1 to tier 2, we want those students to be able to return back into the classroom again, if possible. It's about managing our resources carefully. So when we're looking at numbers, we know that if our intervention strategies in the classroom are correct, our support strategies are correct, about 80 to 90% of students will be able to access supports, whether that's in a special school or a mainstream school, they should be able to be learning. We also know that about between 10 and 15% will need additional support, and out of that 10 to 15%, 1 to 5% will need that higher level intensive support. What we want to do is to be able to make sure that after those supports are provided, the students are learning and then they can return back to that tier 1 classroom. We need to use data to make sure that we know who needs help at what point of their learning journey. Just to explain this further, this is a demonstration of how response to intervention works. So in the following example, student A, student B, student C, student D, student E, student F, student G, student H, and student I are all in a literacy class, learning to read together. Now, the strategies being used with the whole class is effective for students A, B, C, D, E, and F. But unfortunately, student G, student H, and student I require additional support. So we move them to tier 2, and that's that secondary level where they get targeted small group support around learning to read. Now, fortunately, this support worked for student G and student H. They've been doing intensive reading lessons with a specialist teacher. Now they've developed the skills, they can return back to their class. Unfortunately, student I is still not getting it. They're still not making learning progress. So we need to provide them with specialised intensive one-to-one support. This involves regularly testing them to make sure they're making progress. If they're not making progress, we need to ask why, and we need to get that extra support. Once they've received about 6 weeks of instruction, that's when we want to be able to see progress. Ideally, student I will develop enough skills that they can return back to the class. This is the clinical teaching cycle. This is a way of planning and implementing and monitoring intervention. And it's a really good model to use and one that we teach for all our university students. This is the idea of systematically deciding what a learner is ready to learn and what evidence supports this. Then asking, what are the possible evidence-based interventions? Then we need to think about what is the preferred intervention and how will it be resourced and implemented. Then we ask, what's the expected impact of learning? How will this be evaluated? This is finding out how we're actually going to know whether or not what we're doing is working in our classrooms, whether it be a tier 1 support program or a tier 3, using that language from response to intervention. Then we need to think about how are we monitoring learning? What benchmarks are we setting to see progress? And finally, the last step of the clinical teaching cycle is what happened after the implementation of the intervention and how can this be interpreted? So if you put in place a literacy intervention and you've gone through the steps, was it effective or was it not? What happened? Did it work? If it did work, we can go back to the top of the cycle and say, well, what are they ready to learn now? What's the next step in their learning journey? If it didn't work, we have to ask, why didn't this intervention work? And we start back at the start of the cycle again. It keeps going round and round. It's a cycle. It's a way of systematically planning intervention. Finally, I want to talk about assessment instruments. This is the idea of how we are knowing that what we're doing is effective. Assessment is for teaching. It informs what we are doing as the teacher. I would suggest looking at the Abilities-Based Learning Educational Support Program, known as ABLES, as one possible model for you to look at. This is based on research from the University of Melbourne, working with the local Department of Education. This is an assessment tool that allows you to be able to observe your students' disabilities and to identify what they're ready to learn, and also provide some teaching strategies how to get to the next level. It's based on teacher observation and using developmental continuums, and these are really good, effective ways of doing this. There's a whole lot of different developmental continuums out there. This is just one way of identifying what a student can do and where to next. This on the following page is a rocket rubric. These are reports that Victorian teachers get about showing what students with disabilities can do, what the next developmental level should be in each area of the curriculum. It provides a pathway, and then it provides teaching strategies to assist. So this is an example of an ABLES rocket rubric. These are used in all special schools and many mainstream schools in Victoria. The last thing I want to talk about is the idea of behaviour as serving a function. Behaviour does serve a function, and it's understanding what the student's saying. We want to be able to be behaviour detectives, understanding the idea of behaviour being related to antecedents and consequences, and the idea that behaviour might be impacted by factors beyond the immediate antecedents and consequences. This is the idea of when a student shows a certain behaviour in class, what's happened before and happened after this behaviour? For some students who don't speak, it's really difficult to understand what they're thinking. We need to be behaviour detectives. This is what this diagram on the following page shows here. Working out what is the student trying to access or get away from, and what could be the possible motivator for that student. This is a really simple flowchart for you to try to understand the function of the behaviour of the students in your class. Please feel free to take a photo. Okay, and finally, we're going to talk about some intervention strategies that you could use. In terms of supports intervention strategies, I just want to show you a number of examples. The first is looking at visual supports. Having a help card on your desk can be really helpful for your students. If a student finds it difficult to ask for help, it's important to have a help card so students can just hand you that card and say, this says, hey, I need your help. Having things like finish boxes and setting up visual schedules so students can be seeing what they're doing now and what they're going to be doing next and when they're going to have a break can help them to understand what you expect from them. This will help your students to order the tasks that are in your class, and these schedules can help the teacher to help the student understand what they should be doing. Having these visual schedules as a whole class is a really good step to support students, but it's also really good for having individual schedules that can help some students who need a more detailed breakdown of a task. I also want to show you video self-modeling. This is the idea of showing students carefully edited videos of themselves performing a skill. You edit out all the mistakes in the video. This has been found to be really effective for students, particularly on the autism spectrum, to be able to learn new skills. It's filming a student attempting the skill, editing out the mistakes so the footage just looks like the student successfully completing the skill or the task, and then showing them that edited video. They can see themselves completing the skill and they can base their own behaviour off the video model. Peer-mediated intervention and instruction is where you train up students to support other learners and to be able to help those peers to support the students with disability to complete tasks. I won't show you this short video now, but I have provided a link in the slide where you can see an example of peer-mediated intervention and how you can train up some students to help other students in your classroom. Finally, digital games-based intervention is the idea of using cooperative video games, and this is my primary area of research, to develop social skills or social capabilities. If you use digital games-based learning or digital games-based intervention, there's a whole lot of different resources you can use. We use cooperative video games as spaces for developing social skills for students with disabilities and differences. We focus on teaching skills through video games like turn-taking and negotiation and collaborative problem solving, all of these really, really important 21st century skills. Thank you very much. If you want to email me with questions, my email address is on the screen. It's matthew.harrison@unimelb.edu.au, or you can follow me on Twitter @hatdesigns. Thank you for having me and best of luck.
Спасибо, дорогой Мэтт.
Thank you, Matthew, for a very detailed presentation of your support system. Matthew, we have a question here. Could you answer it right away? This is a question from the audience. Additional support, is it a separate effort by the teacher in the class or a separate room in the school? A teacher, student, one teacher and one student. And of course, additionally, I would like to say, you have said that you have a system for special schools. Can you briefly describe the special school system in your country? So, this is the second part of the question.
Yes, no problems. To answer the first part of the question, typically it's in a different room. The support is provided in a different room in the school. Some schools do try to keep the children all in the same classroom, but it depends on school to school. The second question, in relation to special schools, we have different systems in different states within Australia. So we're a federation of states, like in the USA or like China, in that each state has their own education jurisdiction and the policies change state to state. In my state, there are many special schools for children with more complex disabilities or more complex behaviours. So 47% of children with disabilities in my state attend a special school. There's different types of special schools for different levels of need. There's special schools for children with mild intellectual disabilities, so IQ 50 to 70. And then there's special development schools for students with more complex disabilities, IQ sub 50, or what we term extreme behaviour. Does that answer the questions?
Да, спасибо.
Yes, thank you, Matthew, very much. I think we will have more questions for you and for other presenters. Thank you very much, Matthew. Now, our next presentation is by Larisa Vitalyevna Samarina. She is the director of St. Petersburg Institute for Early Intervention. She is the candidate of Pedagogical Sciences. She is from Russia. The topic is conducting assessment procedures for development of individual early intervention programs. Larisa Vitalyevna, the floor is yours. Good morning, colleagues. Let me introduce myself once again. I am from St. Petersburg, Larisa Samarina. I am the director of Early Intervention Institute. This institute has been in place since 1992, developing early intervention in Russia, and we have advanced pretty long way. Early intervention is now drawing some new regulation and legislation. Such assistance technologies as early intervention will be provided to children at a legislative basis. Today, I would like to focus on a very specific topic. I would like to talk about how assessment procedures are carried out. First of all, please pay attention. The early intervention process, as previous speakers said, this assessment has a number of tiers or number of stages. These stages are presented here on the slide. We know that for a child to receive early intervention, the family must first approach the institution for early intervention, and that institution will carry out an assessment, and if the needs are confirmed, then assessment procedures are carried out. I would like to draw an analogy with medicine. Before a physician prescribes treatment, the physician carries out some sort of diagnostics. The physician prescribes some lab tests, blood tests, or X-ray, or they can prescribe ultrasound, because the physician needs to know what is the state of the organs of the patient. Early intervention follows the same path. We cannot prescribe intervention if we have not conducted an assessment, if we don't know the whole situation, how the child develops, what's happening to them in their lives. And only after the assessment procedures do the specialists start developing the individualized program. That is, assessment procedures is a mandatory component of specialists in early intervention. Without these assessment procedures, we can prescribe incorrect interventions. For example, if we don't know how how retarded the children is in their development, we can set goals that do not meet the child's development state. And in this way, we can fail. So what are assessment procedures aimed at? They're aimed at identifying how the child is functioning now, how the child is developing now. They're also aimed at identifying what is the health status, what is the of the child. Therefore, without taking into account the health status of the child, we can cause them harm. For example, if the child has epileptical fits, and we decide to help them use their eyesight, and use shimmering toys, we can provoke deterioration in the health of the child. Also, we also take into account how the child is involved in all life situations, in the real life situations, how active the child is in their life situations, how involved they are. Why do we need this? We need this to be able to achieve the global intervention goals. We want the child to be as independent as possible in the life situations in which they live. Also, it is important to assess what is the state of the family. Do the family have resources to help the child? What are the needs of the family, and what are the priorities? What is important for the family at the current moment? We don't have to imagine, for example, that we should develop something for the child, this or that. We should we should be based on the family needs. To, prescribe assessment procedures, we need to appoint a lead specialist, and this lead specialist will collect a team of specialists who will provide these assessment procedures. He will provide the liaison with the family, he or she, and they will describe what kind of procedures have been prescribed. They will organize the discussion of the whole process with specialists and the family. Please look at the diagram. This is how the situation stands now, and where the leading specialist is. We have the child and their family. We have the lead specialist who provides liaison with the team of specialists. And this is the early intervention. For assessment procedures, they can dedicate about 120 minutes. So assessment procedures is quite a long story. We cannot identify everything within one time. Assessment procedures can be provided on or offline, and the outcome of the assessment procedures is the child's functioning profile, which will enable us to set our goals. Talking about the assessment procedures, we can say that assessment procedures lead to an individual program, and between these there are several assessment procedures. These are the components of assessment procedures. The first component is the assessment of daily life situations. Why are we working with the family? Why are we organizing early intervention? To help the child become more independent in their daily life situations, to help child be involved in the life situations, to help the child and their family build relationships during such life situations. For that purpose, we study the daily life situations. The second component is the differential diagnostics, and I will briefly talk to you about each of the components. Analysis of health, in-depth assessment, and assessment of motivators. And these five components will enable us to get a quite a detailed picture, which will enable us to set appropriate goals for the early intervention program. I would like to now talk about principles of conducting interdisciplinary assessment. It is, first of all, this assessment is individualized. For each type of family, we provide certain type of assessment. We involve the family, and the family will provide us a lot of information how the child functions on a daily basis. The focus of this assessment is the child and family life quality. These are not isolated procedures. It is to identify how the daily life of the child and family flows. Of course, the assessment is based on the needs of the child and family. We also try to identify what ancillary equipment or means the child is using. The assessment tries to identify what the child can already do. So we are looking for the strengths of the child, what the child can already do on their own, and what they do using helps of others. So, and what the child still faces difficulty doing. Why do we need this gradation? We need this to have an accurate assessment. Assessment should take into account risks for secondary impairments, and the assessment should use standardized forms and methods of observation. So we need to plan assessment procedures in the correct way. So this is one of the forms. On the left, we can see all the assessment components. And when the lead specialist collects the assessment, the specialist team, they discuss and they plan when to provide each component of the assessment. And they, appoint specialists for each. They appoint each component a specialist, and they appoint dates, and they determine what will be done. And now we will look more closely at each component. Component one is assessment of daily life situations or routines. These are home activities that happen every day on a routine basis that are predictable. So, what kind of daily life situations can there be? These are usual. This is the usual life of the child and their family. This is washing their face, toilet, eating, etc. Many people think erroneously that if we if we develop some isolated skills, the child will use those skills in their daily life. Unfortunately, this doesn't work in early age children. We must understand in what life situation the new skill can be used. In what life situations some skills are lacking. So therefore, the first component, the most important component of assessment procedures is the assessment of daily life situations. The methods for assessing these can be different. These can be interview with parents when they describe their typical day. It can include questionnaire parents, where parents assess how the child functions in each life situation. It could be observations of a specialist when they come on a home visit. This could be the view of a video made by parents for specialists to assess a life situation. Please look at an example of such life situation as eating, which the specialist looks at from the preparatory phase to the dishwashing phase. What happens? First, the specialist describes all stages of the routine. What happens? What happens in the beginning? What happens afterwards? How the mother made the table, how she called the child, and highlighted in yellow are the fifth and sixth stages. The child does not look at the mother when the mother reaches the spoon, and the mother turns the child's head for them to be able to reach the spoon, for the child to reach the spoon. Here it is quite clear that there is problems with communication. The child does not respond when the child is being called by her mother or his mother. The child does not respond when the mother reaches the spoon. So what could be the reasons for these difficulties? And it is our task to find out what are the reasons. And when our assessment procedures identify the reasons, we understand that communication also requires development, and the development of communication will happen in different procedures, in different life situations. For example, at the training sessions with language pathologists. And it is language pathologists who will teach children to respond to calls. Or, for example, during resource routines, during preparations to go outwards, when the parent will call different and show different objects, different pieces of clothing. And of course, the situation will be changed. During eating, the parent, the mother, will be sitting in front of the child, open her mouth widely, and give signals for the child to take the meal. But here we have identified that at stages 5 and 6, the child faces difficulties, and we're talking about eating. The child faces difficulties communicating. And where do these communication difficulties stem from? And for this, we need differential diagnostic, and to find out what difficulties can cause communication problems. So what is differential diagnostics? Please look at this diagram. For example, if the child has difficulty producing messages, the reasons for these difficulties can be 5 of them. There can be 5 of them, starting with hearing impairment, mental functions, autistic spectrum disorders, voice and speech disorders, or interaction disorders. So which of these disorders caused difficulties for this particular child? So this is why we require differential diagnostics. And in this particular case, we see the hearing assessment will be conducted by audiologist. Hearing and voice will be assessed by speech pathologist. The voice formation structures will be assessed by neurologists. Cognitive development will be assessed by special pedagogues, and autistic disorders will be checked for by a psychologist or another specialist who can do it. So see, for only for message formation, we will have to test 5 different hypotheses, and only after we know the exact reason, we will know what exactly we need to do. And if we see that it is hearing impairment, the pathway is clear. The child will have to receive ancillary equipment or hearing aids. If it is a mental function disorder, the pathologist will take into account this particular disorder. If we understand that the child has autistic spectrum disorders, it will be a totally different program, and so on and so forth. Thus, the differential diagnostics that we have been talking about is aimed at setting hypotheses on the reasons on the causes for the child's difficulties. And further on, if need be, maybe the component 3 will come into play, study of health status that will, and this assessment can be provided if the child has health difficulties. It can be mandatory or it can be non-mandatory. It is planned and conducted in concert with pediatrician, developmental pediatrician. I can give you an example when such assessment can be needed. For example, we are referred a child who is a 2-year-old child, and we observe in this child big difficulty social with interaction and social communication. And the parents say that sometimes they encounter situations when the child, as it were, freezes, as it were. For example, the child has been playing with a toy and then froze for several seconds, and then kind of softened down and then goes back into the game again. The pediatrician will suspect epileptical fits, the minor epileptical fits, and here we ask parents how have they ever assessed the child for epileptical fits, and then the specialist refers the child for epileptical fits. A knowledgeable pediatrician developmental pediatrician, after observing the child for a while, they can notice some peculiarities of the child's development, or they can study the case history. They can suspect certain difficulties affecting the child's development. For example, in our institute, we had cases at the first visit. The pediatrician suspected hearing and eyesight impairs, which were confirmed afterwards, and also rachitis, which was confirmed afterwards. So our goal is to identify what is with the help of the child. Later on, component 4, in-depth assessment of the child's developmental skills. There are 9 domains, but we don't do all the domains. We first select the domains where we see difficulties. If we see that the child is developing well in the motor area, we will not assess it. But if we have need for communication, we will assess communication. In-depth assessment is done according to ICF domains. For each domain, there is a protocol of assessment which allows us to assess the child's activity in the full complex. And lastly, we have the motivation assessment, the child's motivator assessment. Why do we need it? We need it to find out what the child likes, what the child likes to play with, what the child likes eating, So the child needs to do what they like, and only what the child likes, and the activity with what the child likes will lead to the child's learning. As I have said, the results of the assessment procedures is quite a large report. And in this report, we describe the child's developmental level at the current moment in time. So we describe what the child can do well. We also describe what the child is learning to do to identify the zone of the proximal development. We describe the child's needs, in what life situation the child needs help. We describe the functions and structures of organism. For example, the muscle spasticity, the articulation apparatus which impedes speech. We assess the environment of the child, which impact the activity of the child. The main result of the main outcome of the assessment is the individual program goals. Without assessment procedures, the goals of the program will be inappropriate to the child's developmental level. Therefore, they will not yield positive results, or may not yield positive result. Thank you very much. You can ask me question, and I will, but either by email or in the chat. I also have some family Instagram page. There are lots of materials on early development of children on that Instagram page. If necessary, I can answer your questions. Thank you very much, Larissa Vitalyevna. With the Early Intervention Institute, we have been having quite long-standing relations. We started working with you in 1994. I think that we have quite good ties with your institute, and today's audience will contact you and work together with you. Thank you very much. And there is another thing I wanted to say. You mentioned planning assessment procedures. And it is this point that requires tools. And I would like to say that today we will have a presentation by a social worker, Kaisa Nurberg, who will, I hope, she is the author of Living Skills, and she is the author of this toolbox for assessing procedures. Thank you very much, Larissa Vitalyevna. Allow me to pass floor to the next speaker.
Elena Markava, head of the family organization Klubok.ru from Helsinki, Finland, to talk about the prevention and assessment of the child development within the framework of state services of family centers, the Finnish experience. We don't hear the sound yet. Hello, dear participants of the conference. Good day. My name is Lena Markova, and I've been working for the past 10 years with immigrants in Finland. 2 years ago, I was talking at a conference about how children's consultations work in Finland, and now I will tell you what happens further with them. And just getting ahead, I'd like to say that they're still there. They are developing. Now, what is a family center right now nowadays in Finland? It's when all services for a family with children is all under one roof, gathered under one roof. That's done so that we can support parents to fortify the parents, give them access to various specialists, and also family centers render support to families at the families' homes. What are the objectives of the work of the family centers? To provide the protection of the process of bringing up children and teenagers, to help parenting, to save the family's resources, to use professional skills of experts that work with in family centers. And this demands from the professional staff a similar understanding, coordinated understanding of the goals of the family center. And for that, we need good coordination of the work and the provision of the services, and also knowledge and bringing up children and knowledge of what family happiness is, what it's based on, family well-being. And also the specialists working in the family centers are constantly cooperating with the customers, and they use evidence-based methods of work. And it's very important that the family members carry out prevention work, and they provide families support on the very early stages of the issue, whatever it is. And it may be issues of relationships in the family, bringing up the child, or a suspicion or a certain diagnosis with the child. What sort of services can we find there? It's that children's consultation. It's that place where they manage the woman since the beginning of their pregnancy, and the same nurse manages the child until they're 6 years old. Then the child is moved to the management of the school nurse. And then in the family center, they have social management of nurses. They have a dentist, a general practitioner, various specialists of also special level. That's when they need an intervention of childcare services, or working with people with disabilities, or special medical services are also available at the family center. Now, the working model of the family center is when around the client you've gathered a whole range of services which satisfy their needs. There are families that need support periodically, and this is the majority of families. And in that case, we should provide the maximum availability of these consultations of social services, as well as fast support at the early stages of the problem. But there are families where support is needed constantly, and in this case, the family goes through an interview where they evaluate the needs of this family in a given situation. They appoint a responsible specialist who manages the family carrying out their support plan. The family centers work stationary, so that's just like a building, and it usually goes together with a polyclinic, or you can get them online. You can get a lot of support online, and online interaction in Finland, especially now, is growing very rapidly. For various situations in families, we've developed various models of working, depending on what happens and what type of support they need. There is a team of children's consultation specialists. There is a team of specialists who work with kindergarten, with children in kindergarten, and coordinate with the kindergarten. There are specialists who work with school-age children. There are specialists who assess the needs and support families with children. There's also a working model for Swedish-speaking families. Now, in accordance with the needs of the client, working models unite professionals, healthcare systems for specific work around a specific situation, around a specific family. Now, let's look at what this team of children's consultation looks like. What is it like when a problem arises in the family, when certain issues arise? Any family will visit at least once a year this children's consultation, where the child is managed until they're 6 years old. And the representative of the child consultation, you have a nurse there which manages this family, and she will say that there is a possibility to solve your problem having gathered a team of specialists. And after the team of specialists starts their work, they take a certain decision, they make a decision, they create a plan of support, and within 1 or 2 weeks, they contact the family in order to manage the implementation of the support plan further. And now, in more detail, there are pregnant women, there are families with preschool aged children. There is a certain situation that needs involvement of certain experts. And when coming to the consultation, the client will find out that yes, your problem can be solved. We need to ask the client, and if it's parents, then we need to ask the parents. If it's the child, we will also ask the parents for consent for their situation to start to go into management, for the specialist to start working on it. And together with the client, the nurse will fill out a form of a request for support, and that will then be submitted for approval to the team. And the members of the team is, first of all, that nurse who manages this child. It's a psychologist of the children's consultation. It's a representative of the family consultation, a social manager for working with children. If need be, also narrow specialists like doctors, psychotherapists. And if there is a need, and usually there is a need, they will also have a meeting of the team with the client, with this family. After having discussed the situation, after having searched for the right decisions, they also make a decision and start working on a plan of support for this family. And the responsible person is usually that nurse who manages the kid, and they will get in touch with the family within 1 or 2 weeks and start implementing the support plan. It's important to note that the assessment of the needs of the family always takes place together with that family, because only those people who live day to day in that situation and having that issue, they are the best source of how to solve that issue. And the task of the specialist is just listen to them, hear them out, support them, and provide the necessary services. Thus, you can contact the family centers. As I said, you got children's consultations where the child is regularly managed at. And not only the child, actually, when you go to the consultation with your mom or dad or both parents, the nurse will thus manage the whole family and observe the whole family, what's going on, how they interact with the children, with the child, how they interact with other children, with other relatives, and with the parents with each other. They are often tested, the parents, where they are asked certain questions. Also, you can contact with family centers through the social service or the child protection services. Currently, everything also works online in Finland, so the access to the services is provided at the push of a button. At least you can get the contact information really fast. Now, what in practice has changed thanks to opening of these family centers? We've increased the reception hours of specialists. The family centers are working longer than just the children's consultation. The services are much more accessible. Early support in any situation is rendered swiftly and timely. The assessment of needs is done by the team of specialists. Certain special services are available aimed at supporting this specific customer. Multidisciplinary specialists are all in one place, all in one time, and we also use mobile working instruments. Also, the specialists of the family centers can come to the people's homes to get acquainted with the situation of the family, try to help find a better targeted solution. And so family centers in Finland today is supportive parenting, it's early diagnosing and identification of diseases, and that's multidisciplinary team of specialists all together. That's available, accessible, and convenient. Thank you very much for listening. That was my presentation. And it was very nice for me to hear also the speakers from Kazakhstan and St. Petersburg. I'm seeing a lot in common between our systems, and it's very pleasant for me to be here together with you. Thank you very much. If you have questions, I'm ready to answer them. Thank you very much, Elena. And I'd like to point out that if in our conference right now we have some people from the healthcare system, in particular those the National Research Institute of Pediatrics, and these so-called cabinets of the healthy child, and the regional healthcare departments, because right now we're developing an article of the law to replace this Soviet time cabinet of the healthy child. And what I would like to say, and I'd like to emphasize that we need to study this system, at least to borrow certain things in terms of the algorithm of managing children and arranging early assistance, in terms of having that being included into this new draft about these early development cabinets. Thank you very much, Elena. Now, I apologize. I got it confused a little bit now. Instead of passing the floor before Elena, it was supposed to be Eliseva Irina, head of the Laboratory for Special Inclusive Education at the National Scientific and Practical Center for the Development of Special Inclusive Education, candidate of Pedagogical Sciences. And the topic of her speech is inclusion and psychological and pedagogical support of school children with disabilities in general education of the Republic of Kazakhstan. The floor is yours, Ms. Irina. Thank you very much, Ms. Suleimanova. Good day, dear conference participants. Now, today and yesterday, my colleagues have already spoken about the fact that the law on education of the Republic of Kazakhstan will now include new amendments and new terminology to develop the inclusion in general education. And they now have the notion of psychological and pedagogical support as one of the conditions to educate people with children with disabilities. Now, this psychological and pedagogical support is defined as a systematically organized activity in a process of which they create special pedagogical conditions to train people with disabilities based on their special education needs. It is supposed that we will create, and the authorized body in education will approve the rules of this psychological and pedagogical support. That's very relevant for our country today, as currently we are creating and establishing various structures in general education schools which start to provide support in managing children with disabilities. And these structural units have varying names, like a cabinet of support or inclusion cabinet, or a resource room, resource center. They're slightly different in their functionality. The staffing with specialists, which, according to our observation, is not really having the idea progress further, because there are some lacks in the coordination of these structures, and they absolutely don't have a system built up of how they work. It's not organized, so this is what we need right now. Now, the rules should be created based on scientific research, practical scientific research, as it happens in the whole world, especially the system of education of our country. And this type of research? This type of research was started at our center, and they've been in action since the enactment of this program from 2011 through 2019, when we first set the task of developing inclusive education. In the focus of our attention are children with disabilities, who are one of the groups of children with special education needs. Now, in our scientific work, we've involved several laboratories of our center who work in close cooperation as a single team, coordinating stages. Now, the methodological basis of our research activity are, first of all, ideas of humane pedagogics and psychology, which currently are stated as the basis for reforming general education in the Republic of Kazakhstan, and that reform started in 2016. Also, the social and cultural paradigm in organizing the educational process of children with disabilities, where they shift from the medical model, and that started in our country. And this synergy approach in organizing pedagogical support, because we've involved into this process various types of specialists, various stakeholders in the education process. And definitely we cannot neglect the many years of experience and the great advancements of methodologies in assessing the needs and pedagogical and psychological support of children with disabilities, which have been developed by special psychologists and special pedagogues, teachers, and are used by our practitioners. A wonderful speech by Miss Larissa in terms of how fine-grained and how detailed and how wonderfully they've developed the system of assessing the needs of young children. But pretty much we can use the same principles in working with school-aged children. And so the psychological and pedagogical support is actually a collective activity where you have involved the school administration and the teachers and the support services which are now arising in our general schools. And we try to then in our research we are looking at two components of psychological and pedagogical support. It's the organizational component and the content. And both of these components are based on a team approach, which is the only thing that can provide for a coordinated activity of all the stakeholders in the education activity, including the teachers, the administration, the parents, and the children themselves. And the organizational component includes the identification of functional responsibilities of each of the stakeholders of the education process, their hierarchy for the effective process, their document flow, the local legal acts which are needed to manage the process of support. And the content component includes the ideology of inclusive education, which needs to be understood fully, and you need to be devoted to that idea. And also the methodologies, the technologies of assessment of special education needs of school children, the methodologies of rendering flexibility to the education process, the overcoming of barriers that cause difficulties with children learning. Of course, the diagnostic materials which are needed to assess the special needs and to monitor the quality of the support, as well as didactic means for the teacher. Now, as of today, we've defined and partially tried, and the trials continue. Some materials have already been published. The following results, outcomes of our research. These are functional responsibilities of the stakeholders in the education system and their hierarchy, the documentation forms of the psychological and pedagogical support as a new structural unit, and samples of local legal acts which are required to manage the process of psychological and pedagogical support on school level, and also the sequence of assessment of special educational needs and identifying the content of assistance to the student, which is depicted by us as a 12-step algorithm of coordinated activity actions of the teacher, the specialists, and the parents. And we also defined the activity of the special teacher and assisting teacher, which quite recently we've appointed into these schools, and of course the teacher. And the research continues, and we're making correction already to certain materials that we've already developed. And we can take a look now on the slide at that scope of work and that functionality of the specialists of the support service, which we are trying now in these experimental schools of our country. Every specialist does an assessment in order to assess the difficulties of learning and the reasons for them arising. They document the outcomes of that assessment, and they identify the special education needs as a result, which were talked about in very detailed way by Ms. Alia. And they put together individual programs of psychological and pedagogical support for the students together with the teachers and parents. They hold individual and group classes with the students to address the reasons of the difficulties. They render support and help to the student in class in coordination with the class teacher. They consult the teachers, the parents, the administration. They carry out monitoring of the effectiveness of this psychological and pedagogical support. And we've developed a monitoring toolbox focusing on the child's functioning in the classroom environment. And they coordinate with the partners to find additional resources, and that is done with our special schools. And the specialists of the service, as a structural unit of the school, are mandatorily a part of the pedagogical council of the school, which allows them to speak to the teachers about the difficulties, the reasons for the difficulties, the reasons for the bad behavior in class. And you have involved the specialists of the methodological unions, where they have a possibility to expand the competencies of the teachers in terms of the methodology of teaching and the methods of differentiated and individual approach to the students. And of course, they hold workshops, roundtable discussions, individual discussions, where they discuss specific situations in cases arising in a certain class. Now, along with that, we understand that, of course, the main supporting entity of the student with disabilities, because that's the category we're talking about primarily, is the class teacher, because they spend the most time with a child, and the child comes to the school to learn. So what is the functionality of the teacher? They assess the nature of the difficulties. They identify the gaps in learning. And Ms. Alia was speaking about the fact that the first step in assessment was the teacher's function, just like the first stage of supporting a child is supporting the child by the teacher in class. They carry out adaptation of school curricula. They participate in forming individual curricula, and that's the functionality that is also now addressed in our new amendments to the law on education. That function is now applied to the general schools, the adaptation of school program. They individualize the process of education, and they assess the achievements. There are normative acts now that allow the teacher to do this. They also coordinate with the specialists of the psychological and pedagogical support service with other teachers and parents. The new functions of the teacher, these in-demand functions of the teacher that have to do with developing inclusivity in general education, they are very well coordinated with ideas of reforming mainstream education, secondary education, which is going on in our country. The new paradigm of education, education that is result-oriented, and curricula using level-based taxonomy in education, which allows for flexibility in education and assessing the achievements of students. And even the lowest results should be assessed. Now, the values in education is psychological comfort and the success of a student. It is involving every student actively in class, which is exactly what is stated by the ideas of reforming secondary education. And a proactive approach gives methods to the teachers, modern methods, interactive methods, which will provide the activity for the activity of any student in class. And partnership relationships between teachers and students create a situation of psychological comfort, and they initiate a team approach to work, which needs to be learned. That's a completely new competence which traditionally it wasn't taught to teachers in university. And of course, we need to work with that on that with our teachers. And finally, the criterion-based system of assessment of outcomes, learning outcomes, and assessing the results of learning. That is for the teacher. That is their tool for assessing the learning needs, based on which, if required, they can build up an individual approach, and they can provide the flexibility to the education process. Now, unfortunately, specifically this novelty within the framework of the reforms for secondary education, the criterion-based assessment system, and so far isn't being implemented fully as stated. And we still need more scientific research, which should be carried out by our colleagues from mainstream education to provide the flexibility to the education process. We need a wide scale of assessment. So far, it's very narrow with us. And unfortunately, last year and this year, making a step forward in criterion-based assessment, we're making 2 steps backwards for some reason. Because right now, we have a formative assessment. We're assessing education point-based again, although the ideology initially was that this sort of assessment is not without using points. We're looking at the process to have information about which stage the child is experiencing difficulties and where they need help. And now we put that all into a 10-point scale system, and the current point grade will impact the total grade, which in my opinion is not fair and diminishes the effect, or even destroys completely the effect of unbiased assessment of the achievements of students. And I reiterate that, of course, for that we need research, joint research with our colleagues from mainstream education, because that's still an open issue. Now, the expected outcome from the right type of psychological and pedagogical support, it's on the surface, it's easy to see. It's a positive attitude of the student to the school and the teachers and their classmates. It's a minimum of absence, including for being sick, because of being sick. It's academic successfulness. It's within the mainstream or adapted or individual program. It's also the social adaptation of the student, them having friends and hobbies, and following the rules of behavior in school, outside, and at home, and in public spaces. And based on these criteria, it's pretty easy to assess the quality of that psychological and pedagogical support based on those indicators that we've developed. You can trace these interventions. You can increase these interventions or decrease the interventions for every child. It's not very difficult to do. And the results of our research is laid out in certain materials that you can see on this slide here, and you can find them on the website of our center. And we believe that psychological and pedagogical support of school children with disabilities and impairments in mainstream education should not be built on mechanical transferring of experience and tradition of correctional work of special schools on overcoming deficiencies of the child. We've been convinced that it doesn't work. In our understanding, pedagogical and psychological support is, first of all, the flexibility of the education process and the assistance system of helping the child by a team of specialists. And of course, it's based on their special education needs. We need new competencies from our teachers in that regard. And feedback, we're getting feedback from our experimental platforms about how the process of trial of our materials is taking place. The advanced training courses that allows us to see certain barriers that arise in the practice of the schools, which impede the building up of a real psychological and pedagogical support for children with disabilities in mainstream education. And these barriers include the following. It's the autonomy of the work of the service of the psychological and pedagogical support service in the school. When you don't have enough, or you have a complete lack of cooperation with the teachers, with the other stakeholders in the education process, when you don't have an involvement of the administration of the school into the process of management and in the quality control of this support, because the school leadership should be a part of these systemic processes. The lack of competence of the specialists in support, that they have trouble finding the real reasons of the difficulties of the children, and they work in the paradigm of the medical model, and that's about the insufficiencies of training of our defectologists. They should first of all be teachers, and they should understand and know the methodology of how to teach children. And of course, the lack of the material base. A lot of schools are lacking equipment, rooms, and textbooks for the students. And the reason, another reason for the barriers could be an incorrect understanding of the ideology of inclusivity in education, and also stereotypes being present in relation to these children with disabilities, which are further intensified by this training of mainstream teachers when at university. When they're taught at university, the future teachers, they don't just tell anything about these children with disabilities, and then you have a feeling that this isn't even part of their competence. This is the competence of the defectologist. And in terms of how to solve the issues that there are, the outreach is still important, and we need to arrive at a single understanding of what inclusivity is. A lot was said about that yesterday. And outreach, including, will start together with the centers which are being opened this year in our country, the regional centers, the resource centers for developing inclusive practices and experience exchange, and they're being established based on mainstream education schools that have a good experience of that work in a modern way and that understand the principles and the essence of reforming mainstream education. The management of these centers will be carried out by our national center, and we will be striving for coming up with a single understanding and to broadcast the outcomes of and put our research results into practice. Of course, it's also about improving the content of university curricula of teachers, special pedagogues. I agree with our Belarusian colleagues that the training of teachers should be proactive, that they should form a pedagogical and not just lagging behind the practice, the school practice that's becoming obsolete. And we need to work with our university colleagues. And we need professional support of current teachers on an ongoing basis. There's a lot of issues, and our center is dealing with that work in a more detailed and structured way. Well, and I also believe it important the coordination in the management of process of inclusion of children with disabilities in cities, in regions, via so-called coordination councils, where we can also build up our work in a structured way, negotiate, learn to understand each other. Besides, we have positive experience in Kazakhstan. The Akmola region for many years now has been in a wonderful way coordinating these issues of including children into education. Well, in the end, I'd just like to say that in our country, we do not believe it to be an indicator of development of inclusion of closing special schools and the reduction of their number. Although we hear such recommendations sometimes from our international experts, we don't believe it to be the way. In Kazakhstan, in special schools, we have no more than 1.5% of children from the total school population, which is 3 or 4 times less than in developed European countries that are successfully developing mainstream education based on inclusivity. Perhaps that success is characterized by that factor. In special schools, we're teaching, just to compare with our dear speaker from Australia, 14% of the number of children that have recommendations in diagnoses from the medical and pedagogical consultation. So we believe it important to maintain, to save that special school system so that parents can choose the most comfortable conditions to teach their child. So if it's mainstream and if it's too much stress for the child, it might decrease their quality of life. So some people wouldn't want that. Thank you for listening. That's it for me.
Большое
Thank you very much, Irina Gennadievna. The thing is that everything said by Irina Gennadievna, the ideas for reforming secondary education, all of it refers to the general pedagogy. The inclusive education idea came in 1999 with our center. And honestly saying we cannot explain to the pedagogues, to the National Academy of Pedagogy, that it is a task of the general education. And we cannot explain to them why it is on that it is not only the inclusive education center that should be dealing with this matter. And I'm calling on everybody. I'm calling on those at Nazarbayev University, Nazarbayev Intellectual Schools. This is the force that is required to, to do what has been spelled out in the algorithm for developing the education system in Kazakhstan. So the Ministry of Education, we need to take this question under control, and we should coordinate and regulate it. Therefore, thank you very much, Irina Gennadievna, for this very fundamental and methodologically backed presentation. Aliya Kasimkhanovna and you have detailed this situation in Kazakhstan and ways to improve it. The next presentation will be dedicated to also to assessment of needs. I would like to give floor to Kaisa Nyberg, who is the founder and director of Living Skills Company. She has a degree in public administration. She's a master of applied sciences. Her talk will be on varieties of facts and inclusion is choice. Kaisa, the floor is yours.
Hello. My name is Kaisa Nyberg, and I am a founder and CEO of the Finnish company Living Skills. I have a long career in social and health sector services in Finland. For example, I have few years managerial experience in working in disability services, but at the moment I'm also doing doctoral research on sales experience of care units. I moved to private business in 2016 by founding Living Skills company, which has developed digital tools for assessing functional ability and needs of people with disabilities. But before moving on to actual topic, I'd like to take the opportunity to congratulate our partner CenterSat, its 25th anniversary and the 75th birthday of the center's director, Professor Doctor of Pedagogical Sciences, Rosa Suleimanova. It has been a great honor to cooperate with such a professional organization working with and promoting the interest of the people with disabilities in society and great pleasure to work with Mrs. Rosa Suleimanov and her team who work for great cause with big heart and soul. We are really excited about our cooperation in Kazakhstan, in which we together developed the system of individual needs assessment of people with disabilities using our Living Skills tool. But let's move to my topic. Diversity is a fact, inclusion is a choice. I'm going to speak about how assessing the functional capacity of people with disabilities and focusing on their strengths promotes inclusion. Let me start by a brief summary of consequences and side effects of becoming ill or having disability. If you get ill or have disability, you often stick too much to the role of patient and identity of a sick person. You can feel that you lose your independence, feeling like you become a child who is dependent on others. Your social relationships can restrict mainly to interacting with professionals like care personnel. The longer you live in a closed environment with minimum activities, the less is your chance to feel integrated and included into society. Let's talk about stigmatization a bit, because it has such an important negative impact on the quality of life. First, it means other people stigmatizing you. The reason for this is often ignorance, biases, and discrimination. It also means self-discrimination. You might want to hide your problems, isolate yourself. Or just a moment. And feel inadequate and inferior. In Finland, we believe that even though you have an illness or disability, it's just one part of your life. It shouldn't be your whole life. It's crucial to understand that you can still create and maintain good relationships with other people, be fully included and finding your place in the society, and all in all, experience well-being in life. In other words, this kind of thinking can be called recovery orientation. It means that you can have a good life despite your disabilities. You can have good friends and find your place in a society. Your life is meaningful and has a purpose. You are a subject, not an object of your own life. You are aware of your strengths and development targets. You can use your skills and abilities. You are skipper of your own boat and make your own decisions. In Finland, we also think that it's more useful to focus on person's strengths than problems or illness. The treatment and recovery program can be built on making the strengths even stronger. It builds good basis for inclusion. We are all diverse and we can utilize our strengths. Our disabled people have their strengths, and it's up to the society how welcome and included the society makes them feel. Let me tell a few examples of inclusion. British actress Sarah Cody was awarded an MBE at Buckingham Palace by Prince William in 2018, and she became the first woman with Down syndrome to be given the honor. She plays the role of Katie in the British TV show A Word, which is about different people with different stories to tell. The characters are very real. What happens to them feels real. We are all as complex and individual as the next person, she says. In the series, Katie and her boyfriend Ralph, whose actor has Down syndrome too, makes very independent choices. They decide to get married and live in their own home despite the concerns their families have. Next, I'll tell you another example about inclusion from Finland. As a young nurse, I worked with children with learning disabilities. During that time, the law was changed and these children were given the same rights to go to school as other children. I remember a boy who was very awkward in the care unit. He stole food from our children's plates and at almost every meal ate clothes and messed up. But when he went to school with his personal assistant, a miracle happened. He began to communicate in sign languages. All the problems with him were over. It was even possible to take him to a kitchen to help with serving without him stealing any food. I think that he was just frustrated without the meaningful action in the past. Now that we have seen what inclusion means in practice, we will go to basic conditions needed to arrange good disability services and care so that inclusion can happen. In Finland, the services are organized the following way. The tasks are based on Finnish law. The state decides which services the municipalities must provide. Municipalities can produce the services themselves or buy the services from private sector companies, associations, or trusts. The municipalities controls the quality of services and meeting the client interests. It's important to understand that assessment of disabled person needs is always cooperation. A good quality assessment of his or her needs combines the person's own assessment of his or her needs for support and help, assessment by family members, and assessment by professionals. Which professionals take part in a service need assessment process in Finland? First of all, social worker has the main responsibility. Additionally, other professionals can take part in a process, for example, physiotherapists, occupational therapists, or doctors. We can increase inclusion by assessing the individual needs of people with disabilities. The aim is that a disabled person can live and function as an equal member of society regardless of illness or disability. Preventing disadvantages and removing obstacles makes it possible. The assessment of disabled persons' needs for services aims to determine if measures, support services, aids, and changes in the living environment will help achieve these goals. Assessing the functional ability of person with disability is in everyday life is necessary to get a good understanding of individual needs. The person's service needs must be considered from the perspective of what kind of support or service he or she needs to be able to participate equally in society. On one hand, the service need assessment identifies different situations and environments in which a person with disability needs help or support. On the other hand, it's equally necessary to identify the situations and environment in which the person copes on his or her own. Services and other supporting measures must support the different roles of the persons in such way that disability doesn't hinder the people from fulfilling, for example, the role of an employee or the role of a parent. A comprehensive service plan is a concrete plan of individual support measures that enable success and inclusion in the society. Let me show you a short example of how professionals can use our modern digital tools in assessing the needs of the disabled person. Finally, I want to give you a recipe for a good service plan. You must focus on the person's strengths instead of problems. Choose disabled person's own goals and objectives as the center of attention and basis of actions. supporting person's network and use it to help the person in achieving the goals. Make sure that service plan is based on genuine dialogue between various parties, the person, family, and professionals. See challenges as lack of skills. Plan goal-oriented activities and make the success visible by setting concrete goals with useful digital tools like living skills. Thank you for your attention. Here is my email address and our website where you can find more about living skills. Thank you.
Спасибо большое.
Thank you very much, Kaisa, for your presentation. Your presentation showed the starting point. What should we be based off to start working with a person with disabilities? Assessing the strengths is important for the person not to wait help from outside, but for the person to feel their own abilities, and it provides a very strong motivation for that person. Indeed, Finland has developed now this software, is very comprehensive. Finland has lots of software for assessing needs, which are used both in Finland and in other countries. Our center has a pilot project on trialing this tool, and we made our own adjustments based on our own environment and mentality. But this was done only for one category, for people with mental disorders. This work is very difficult, and I hope that social workers will show an interest in this work and start proactively participating in this work. And most importantly, will show an interest in learning. Thank you very much, Kaisa. Dear presenters, please let us not forget about the schedule. Up until Kaisa's presentation, our program was built based on methodology, assessment of needs, and we kind of separated, starting with Kaisa's presentation. We see and we hear about specific tools. For example, now I would like to give floor to a surdo pedagogue, to a methodologist, Shepelenko Nina Vladimirovna, and she also is part of program for cochlear implantation. She's from Kiev, Ukraine, and Nina Vladimirovna will talk how pedagogical support is provided to children with cochlear implants based on the skills of phonetic awareness. So this is, I point out, this is a specific methodological recommendation and tool. Nina Vladimirovna, the floor is yours.
Ms. Suleimanova, thank you very much, and I'd like to join in on everybody congratulating you yesterday. The staff of the Center SATER, headed by the wonderful Ms. Suleimanova, and wish you creative success and say a big thanks for our long friendship. We've been friends since 2007. And it is true that today we've heard recommendations about managing and organizing inclusive education. I'd like to talk today more about managing children with cochlear implants. In this field, I've worked for 20 years now. So we've definitely discussed today, and we've understood that early diagnosing and treatment using hearing aids or implants helps us having more and more children with hearing impairments going to mainstream schools, and thus there's a smaller gap. However, the vast majority of children in this category of good communication and speech skills demonstrate significant difficulties in mastering, understanding, and storytelling, which are the necessary factors for academic success. So the question remains, can children with hearing deficiencies or recipients of hearing aids or implants fully open up their potential in education, or are they still in the risk group? And then which methodological ways should we choose to timely render the right support? And choosing the right educational institution is critical to address key things such as psycho-emotional preparedness, academic preparedness. This person should be of the right age or speech good for his age, and also speaking skills, and also the parents' preparedness. There are several issues that should be solved by pedagogues and audiologists who manage children with hearing deficiencies in mainstream schools. These are 4 critical areas that can affect the success of a hearing impaired child in a mainstream school, which is their placement in the classroom and issues that have to do with that, because not always can child hear sound, and also providing technology that help hear information. There should always be a cooperation between the teachers and the family, and what was said many a time today, it is helping the teaching staff from the specialists, because they have a lot of methodological questions. Now, the right choice of the educational institution is critical to addressing key academic challenges when children with disabilities are in class, which is language and literacy development, which in turn involves learning to read and then reading with understanding. And to crack the code, the child must have certain skills, which include cognitive ability to process symbols, adequate auditory perception to use phonetic signals, as well as sufficient vocabulary and experience on the basis of which new information can be interpreted in new words learned in context. Now, amongst the different variety of school subjects, language and mathematics are 2 subjects in the standardized tests of achievement in general education, which we've talked about today. Literacy and numeracy are critical to a person's ability to develop fully as a person. A language is a channel through which children learn about the world and begin to speak and communicate and begin their skills and abilities as effective communicators. First with their parents, and then through participation in societies with others. As for its contribution to reading, language provides access to a wide range of knowledge, which is vocabulary, as well as to world knowledge, since children can learn about things that they can no longer experience. So, as for instance, industrial revolutions or dinosaurs, things that they can no longer experience, like space travel or safari, and things that are within the framework of physical sensations, like fear or love. Mathematics requires reading comprehension and understanding of specific linguistic mathematical terms, such as conditional, comparative, and inference. Consequently, mathematical achievement tends to depend on the ability to read. Therefore, it is expected that solving math problems will be especially difficult for children with hearing loss who have reading and speech problems. Now, learning to read is one of the biggest challenges that children with hearing loss face in mainstream school. The basis of the connection between early speech acquisition and the first academic success is causal. At the same time, the skills of speaking are fundamental precursors to subsequent successful reading. A successful development of speaking depends on several basic skills, which is phonological awareness and verbal working memory. Modeling device models for auditory sensory processing is the first step, followed by phonological segmentation, which comes next. Assigning acoustic analysis to their development, it is not surprising that children with a cochlear implant installed are delayed as a result of sensory deprivation prior to the onset of hearing. So even if a child was implanted at 8 or 10 months, we still have a period of delay in their psychological development for this 8 or 10 months. And so it was correctly voiced today that their interventions should be early and implantation should be early. And therefore, early diagnosis and early amplification are important predictors of future language and educational outcomes. The sequence of skills leading to literacy is hearing the words, listening to the words, so that means attention and memory, understanding the words, using words in speech, noticing the difference between sounds, associating sounds with symbols, and combining characters into words. Many children with hearing problems face serious learning difficulties when learning how to read, which play an important role in the social development of the child. The 5 critical components of reading are phonological awareness, with vocabulary, decoding, fluency, and reading comprehension. And then we can envision that in this graph as a ladder, a stair. We should have a good basic skill to understand what we read. And we can read a text in English and just only understand half of its content. So we should have basic skills. So we should have hearing, vision, listening, and we should have phonological awareness. We should have phonematic awareness. So not just hearing technically, but we should be able to listen and hear. We should have acoustic abilities. So reading and we should be able to decode what's written. We should learn how to read fluently, not just naming every letter in the word. And then we get a good understanding of the material. And before children learn how to read, they need to learn to understand what they hear. So to learn how to hear the word fully. In the children recipients of implants with problems of comprehension are in the zone of risk of developing problems of reading comprehension, even if they can decode words. So if they can read a word, but they can't understand its meaning. And this is due to the fact that implantable hearing aid systems, due to their technical characteristics, so electrode parameters, frequency and spectral resolution, quality settings, adjustment quality, cannot completely normalize hearing, and therefore these children experience difficulties during the listening task. So now, what is phonological awareness? It's a kind of umbrella for all the sound-related skills we teach. It includes listening, manipulating and repeating words, sounds, rhymes, syllables. Typically, normally hearing children at the age of 3 develop phonological comprehension skills through nursery rhymes and rhythm. Phonemic awareness can be defined as the ability to hear, identify, and manipulate phonemes or sounds in words. This is a narrower skill set that focuses on a single word. And these skills are best taught verbally and through listening using a sequence like I say, you repeat, think, and decide. Phonemic awareness improves a child's hearing, reading, comprehension, and spelling ability. The phonetics is the understanding that sounds and block letters are related. Now, this is the first step to reading. The ultimate goal of reading for children is to understand written text and successfully move from learning to read to reading to learn. And as a rule, that's developed at the level from second to third grade for normally hearing children. So what is the progression of phonological awareness? The first thing that a normally hearing child can do is learn how to rhyme words. And we know that very well with normal hearing children. Then identifying sound in a word. Then analytical activity, so we can combine these sounds. Synthetic activity, so we can understand what this word means. And manipulating, so we can change the letters and we can get a new word as a result. The development of phonological skills normally occurs along the trajectory of the development of a syllable rhyme phoneme scheme. And a child with hearing loss cannot skip any of these stages. And we always say that in the foundation of everything, we have ontogenesis. So in the age of 3 to 4 years old, we have awareness of rhymes. In the age of 4 to 5 years old, awareness of syllables. Age of 5 to 6 years old, mixing. So saying k and then ot, and then you have kot, and then 6 to 7 years old, manipulation of phonemes. Change one sound in a word and can be a new word. And most of these skills are normally acquired between the ages of 5 and 7 years old. And that is why there is a question about early hearing aids and early implantation and habilitation support. If children with cochlear implants are lagging behind in basic skills compared to children with normal hearing, then they are at risk of slow decoding of individual words and slow vocabulary learning. Consequently, it is expected that children with cochlear implants are expected to perform worse on reading comprehension tasks than their normal hearing peers. And good quality listening is fundamental to reading comprehension. Each word generates an image in the reader's head. If the word is clear, the images merge one by one into a mental movie, and the reader is no longer focused on letters, but completely switches to viewing images. If an expression or word is not understood, then the occurrence of the problem is emptiness and space, and which is what we see with children. They just read something with good speed and fluency, but they can't retell what they read. And that is why both adults and children do not remember the information that they do not understand. So what we need, in general, children need 4 skills to understand the written word. The ability to quickly decipher and give meaning to new words. And for that, there needs to be a good vocabulary. Syntactic, a structure of sentences, and morphological structure of words and joining words. The ability to extract general meaning from decoded words. So if you read it, that a cat has beautiful eyelashes, you should draw beautiful eyelashes on a cat. The ability to retain meaning in your operating memory when processing new words. Ability to apply a word processing strategy to study unfamiliar words in passages. Knowledge. The skills used in reading comprehension are similar or the same as those used in reading comprehension. We must use bottom-up processes for identifying written texts and top-down processes for interpreting text using semantic and syntactic knowledge. Children trigger interactive reading experiences with top-down and bottom-up in the age of 8 to 14 years old, which is important for children switching from learning to read to reading to learn. What are the recommendations for teachers? For teachers in mainstream schools, when developing individual programs, need to take into account the objective factors, the time of hearing loss, time of implantations, mono or binaural implantation, and also the subjective factors such as cognitive skills, family support, which can impact the quality and the duration of rehabilitation support. In order to improve hearing and improve communicative and speech skills, we need to carry out audio-verbal therapy. So a multi-sensory approach when studying vocabulary. They should see, they should smell, they should feel that word. A training in psychoacoustic and sound discrimination, so which sound it was. Training in the development of auditory attention, how much they can retain in their memory. And verbal memory training, how much the normal hearing child, when they go to school, out of 10 words, they should remember 8. Probably our children won't be able to remember that much. Training in speech perception on the phone, because that's a double acoustic load. And training on perception of sound, of speech and noise. And in order to activate this development, we have several techniques. For instance, there are numerous speech therapy programs designed to support the development of phonological processing skills. It is called phonetic and phonematic sound perception. And when they ask me, what is our assistance, that is your job, phonetic and phonematic sound perception. And likewise, it is possible to work with recipients of implants to improve their listening comprehension. In addition, these corrective efforts should lead to methods that provide these children with an adapted and supportive environment, and we've talked a lot about that today, to reduce the potential stressors that lead to inappropriate behavior. So the socialization a child changes. Learning to read is a challenging task for all children, but especially difficult for people hard of hearing. It's important to understand that although children that use implants get good general skills and go to mainstream schools, they still require specialized rehabilitation programs geared at specific language aspects. Thank you for listening. If there are any questions, I can answer those.
Thank you very much, Nina Vladimirovna. Indeed, talking about the assessment of educational needs, we would like to give specific examples, and Nina Vladimirovna's presentation shows that pedagogues and psychologists must be very clear with ontogenesis, and the scientists or methodologists that develop aids, methodologists, they also have to know it. So as we have just been shown, it all builds on the ontogenesis. Before we have one function in place, we cannot go over it or bypass it. Children with mental disabilities, children with hearing impairments, they experience some very similar difficulties. Thank you very much, Nina Vladimirovna, for a very informative and methodologically oriented presentation. Our next talk, we have two more, and we will have questions and answer session. The next floor goes to Aynagul Rimkhanova from Karaganda State University, determining or assessing education needs for children learning in an inclusive environment. Good afternoon, dear colleagues. I'm happy to greet you at this conference, which is which is dedicated to the most relevant problem of education today. All of us know that inclusive education is advancing in Kazakhstan. If we analyze statistics and the regulations, we can see these advances. But today I would like to focus on several issues, several challenges for inclusive education. The law on education in Kazakhstan was supplemented with paragraphs on certain terms and on certain concepts and other details. These have already been mentioned before me. I would just like to talk about problems that we think are most important. The first is inclusive education is being implemented at a very quick pace, even though there are no required conditions for fully fledged implementation. Second is educational organizations show mainly the positive experience and high deficit in regulations, staff, methodology, and equipment. And we still lack the methodology. And the fourth one is the tendency to introduce foreign experience without the necessary consideration of local conditions. This, of course, entails certain problems, and these are the problems that we encounter on a daily basis at school. These are problems are related to forming classes. While sometimes we have children with combined impairments, also children with risk groups that fall out of the diagnostic procedure and who do not receive appropriate psychological and pedagogical support. Another thing is that subject matter teachers in inclusive classes do not participate in the psychological pedagogical commission of the school. There are also problems with criterial assessment, also overcrowdedness of classes, where and this makes it impossible to teach special children alongside regular children. Also, there is a lack of methodological aids, lack of textbooks, and the main problem is the low preparedness of teachers to deal with children with disabilities, and also the uncertain functions of the assistant teacher. Our specialists developed methodological recommendations for Kazakh mainstream schools with inclusive conditions before the right diagnostic stage allows a good corrective stage. There is the aim being to make sure that the children socialize and are proficient and at school. After analyzing schools, we identified some problems that occur very often. The identification of special needs takes place only when the child comes from a special school to the mainstream school, and when PMPK files a report with recommendations for the assessment. And very often there are special needs that are not captured in the PMPK report. This is the risk group. With this group, they often don't work to identify special education needs, and in difficult situations, parents approach PMPK, and only after that the child receives the appropriate support. Also, we are surprised to find out that subject matter teachers are not involved in this process. Only a special speech pathology pathologist works with the child. The subject matter teachers only give examinations, snapshot examinations, and subject matter teachers should be involved more heavily. And the process of identifying special educational needs should be carried out by all specialists and the subject matter teachers, and as a result of this, they adapt the curriculum. The curricula will be different based on the disability or special conditions or special needs of the child. Therefore, when we talk about standard individual or standard collective curricula, very often teachers ask this question: why don't we develop standard curricula for children in inclusive classes? Teachers should understand that this question is inappropriate because, according to the inclusivity principle, learning should be based on individual needs and individual development level. And the psychophysical disabilities are quite multiple in their type and require different approaches to learning and different approaches in correction. There are lots of examples with children that have autistic spectrum disorders or some mild mental disabilities with autistic features. They are usually taught at special classes in mainstream schools. But here, there's also a need for individual approach because some of these children have autism, which may not, which may include speechlessness. So when assessing special educational needs in these categories of children, we need to be based not on the mental retardation, but take into account the severity of autism, and we also need to consider the possibility of forming a small class consisting of 5 students with autism. Also very important is the question of teaching children with special needs where the number of students exceed 20-25 people. And here we remember the rule that the existence of 2 people with disabilities requires the number of students not to exceed the 20-25 norms. Also, many subject matter teachers would like to have an assistant teacher, irrespective of the children's disorders. And the teachers don't always know in what cases assistant teachers are appointed. And the last thing, as a proposition for the above-mentioned issues, we could mention the following. We could consider a differentiated formation of special classes with children with autistic spectrum diseases. Also, we need to review rules on forming classes in mainstream schools, taking into account with taking into account special need children according to sanitary norms. We need to activate the work of PMPK for timely detection of problems at early stage. And I'm talking about children that have not been assessed by PMPK. And at school PMPK, in school PMPK, subject matter teachers should also be involved to assess special educational needs of specific children. Also, our recommendation is to retrain teachers through seminars, master classes, case studies, and other forms of training through the use of non-government organizations and other stakeholders. The next recommendation is to develop qualification characteristic for the assistant teacher, or job description for the teacher assistant. I have personally encountered teacher assistants who don't know how many children they should be working with. Also, we recommend centralized circulation of good methodologists of practical teachers through the websites of such as Sutter, National Education Academy, etc. And the last recommendation is to develop methodological recommendations with maximally detailed approach to the stages of organizing inclusive education. Also, shift from recommendation to mandatory nature of methodological letters, rules, and regulations to enforce the right organization of inclusive education, because recommended is not mandatory, and it has its effect. In conclusion, I would like to say we do not have enough practice now, and we try to adopt foreign experience. So it's clearly needed to assess what problems we need, and only after we assessed our problems can we put in place an good inclusive education system. I thank you. These recommendations, these proposals are a plan for, as it were, for regulations, and I would like to call on your university, your chair, to work jointly and work jointly with other 17 institutions in Kazakhstan who teach special pedagogues. And I think you need to pool your efforts and work cooperatively. I would like to note that what was said in Irina Gennadievna's presentation, your presentation, and Aliya Kasimkhanovna's presentation is virtually a plan for research work for the years to come. And dear participants, I would like to note that we will have we're having this conference recorded, and you can get back. You can get back and you can look at the presentations on YouTube, etc. The next floor, we put this presentation at the end because it somewhat summarizes what we have, what quality of education we have for children with disabilities in Kazakhstan. The floor is given to Aygul Baytursynova, the senior lecturer of the Institute of Pedagogy and Psychology of Abay Kazakh National Pedagogical University. She's a candidate of psychological sciences. Aygul Amanjolovna, by the way, has defended her dissertation, and She defended her her dissertation in early 2000, and her dissertation was on inclusive education, on problems of assessing the quality of education of children with disabilities in Kazakhstan. The floor is yours.
Good day, dear participants of the conference. It's a great honor for me to present to you today at this conference devoted to the anniversary of my teacher, Ms. Suleimanova. I congratulate you on this anniversary. I'll try to stick with the time limit. I understand everybody's tired now. And now let's do another effort. As they say, the burden of the last camel is always the heaviest. So I'll try to make this brief. And here's my presentation. So one of the key goals that our state has to solve is, in the coming future, we need to assess the results that we've achieved in the Sustainable Development Goals. And this goal number 4 is ensuring inclusive and equitable quality education and promoting lifelong learning opportunities for all. So what is going on then nowadays? The task of ensuring equal access to education in an environment where the coronavirus pandemic has exacerbated the existing national inequalities in access for all to quality education. And this issue is becoming even more particularly relevant. An even more sensitive issue in this relation is the quality of education for children with disabilities and inclusive processes in education. The quality of education as of today is relevant because many a time at this conference already, our dear speakers and Ms. Suleimanova, we've said many a time that there has been a substitution and confusion of the concepts integrated, special, and inclusive in education in relation to the organization of the educational process. And in our dissertation, which we defended a long time ago, like Ms. Suleimanova just said, we looked at the organizational and pedagogical conditions of including children with disabilities into the educational process, where for the first time, we've divided integrated and inclusive education in these two terms. But in spite of much time having passed in our pedagogical community, the Kazakhstani one, there is still this substitution, confusion in these terms. And as a result, we observe the identification of children with special educational needs and children with disabilities. And then we have a shift in the focus of inclusive education. In a situation where you have an inversion of the system of inclusive and special education, this situation discredits the actual values of inclusive education, its ideas and principles, which in the previous sessions the colleagues have mentioned many times. So it's all in the laws, they draft new laws, and the quality of education of children with disabilities is still very relevant today. In this case, the last conference in August of the distinguished Minister of Education, he also said that for Kazakhstan, the priority currently is the quality in the assessment of the educational achievements of the students. And when preparing for this conference, we did an analysis of problems of quality, and this analysis showed us that we don't have a single methodological approach in our country, a unified approach. And there are systemic problems which continue to be relevant, which is legal regulation, the content of education, the issue of creating conditions, it's training qualified staff, and of course one of the acute issues that currently have is quality, ensuring quality assurance. The criterion for assessing the quality of education is the legislation. In this presentation, we tried to do this little analysis of how this is done in terms of legislation and how it's also overseen. Now, based on the example of the State Program for the Development of Education and Science of the Republic of Kazakhstan from 2020 to 2025, the first focus was equality and quality. The analysis of the situation in Kazakhstan on creating the conditions for equality and quality has shown that only 20% of kindergartens, 60% of schools, and 30% of colleges have created conditions for inclusive education. And it's emphasized that it's high-quality inclusive education, and it covers only 28.2% of preschool children, 46.5% of school children. Quality inclusive education, that was. And the next thing that is specified in this program is that an insufficiently developed system of timely response to violations of the rights of children, including those in difficult life situations, and the lack of conditions for inclusive education. And we will say also that safety is the main indicator of the quality and effectiveness of education services. And now, in terms of the legal acts, now how can we assess quality? There should be certain criteria. Order number 366 on amending the order on the approval of a criteria for evaluating educational organization. And it says here that this is a collection of requirements which are used to determine the assessment of organization. If we have organizations, let's look at what organizations are currently working for children with disabilities. In the last version approved 26th of April of 2021, we have these following organizations, which are special organizations: special school kindergarten, special boarding school, and an autism center for support with children with autism or autism spectrum disorder. How is the assessment carried out of this organizational activity, or how will it be carried out based on these criteria? Let's look at the criteria more specific. In paragraph 12, they mention the criteria for assessing educational organizations implementing general educational programs for primary, basic, secondary, and general secondary education. It would seem that the criteria is set, so let's move on. In clause 14, it says requirements for the maximum amount of study load of students, also based on education requirements. And subarticle 3, compliance with the requirements for dividing classes into groups, including taking into account the characteristics of students with special education needs within the framework of inclusive education. This article corresponds to Ms. Einagul's presentation that the classrooms are overcrowded, and in these conditions, of course, for the teachers, it's very difficult to work and to ensure quality education. And also, another criteria is the fulfillment of the requirements of inclusive education in teaching students with special education needs. And the question arises that if these criteria are there, then we should look at the content itself. And what are the requirements of inclusive education? Where are they described and normatively enshrined? I wasn't able to find that. What tools are used to assess the fulfillment of these requirements? So there is an order. The criteria are depicted, but how to measure them, using what tools, it doesn't specify in the law. By what criteria and by whom was quality inclusive education determined, which is in that order. So it says that quality inclusive education. Who assessed that quality of this inclusive education? What are the tools that were used to assess that quality of this inclusive education? And then we finally have the question how to evaluate the activities of the PMPC in the autism centers, which were created to support children with autism and autism spectrum disorder. There's also a question of what is the legal and regulatory framework for autism centers in the feasibility of internal differentiation. So there are legal and regulatory requirements, but how necessary was it to differentiate like this? That's also something that needs to be analyzed. And it also specifies the problem of the shortage of specialists. It says, Garen, I apologize. Could you set the screen so that it can be seen? Make it full screen, because we can't see half the screen. So it's set as 64%, this indicator, in terms of staff in the psychological and pedagogical support service. Now let's say that this is a very simple indicator. We're interested more in the quality of that support and monitoring the effectiveness of these systems during education. And Ms. Irina said today that the rules have been developed, and we will need a coordination of monitoring and assessment of the quality of this psychological and pedagogical support. Also in the program, it says that there is a need to provide a safe and comfortable learning environment and a need to open resource centers on the basis of schools for the development of inclusive practices. In the program, it's been written, and in Kazakhstan, we're actively opening resource centers and offices to support inclusive education. The next question is, in the standard requirements of educational organizations, this type of organization is absent, and the criteria for assessing the quality of education services in this type of organization is also absent. So in one legal document, you have the norm, in the other one, it's absent. And consequently, the whole mechanism itself of the assessment of organization of education and subsequently the quality of that education are not in line with each other. And also at the August conference, I emphasized the importance of monitoring of educational achievements of students, including with disabilities. We will see how can we carry out this monitoring in the context of teaching children with disabilities. And here we have the following issue points, such as the expert assessment of necessary to validate and verify the accuracy of the data, and how will the tests be developed for the children with disabilities. These are questions that need to be solved still, as the order has been approved, and if you have an order, you need to carry out the order. Moving on, the next issue that I'd like to shed light on is obtaining a certificate of basic secondary education, and also in conditions of inclusive education for children with disabilities. Currently, according to Order number 172, children with mental retardation, with mild mental retardation, are getting a certificate of basic secondary education. And in that certificate, there is an appendix which differentiates these children. However, given the inversion in this special education, we need to once again review carefully the actual norm of issuing the certificate. It's a serious issue because as of today, the children with mental retardation, there are cases when they They are referred to organizations of professional education which are not up to their mental, which are on a different level than their mental development level. And Ms. Irina spoke today, and the previous speakers talked about the relevance of developing a criterion-based system of assessment. And the National Academy of Education in 2015 developed the recommendations. However, they only encompass children with mild impairments. So we currently have the important task of an evidence-based approach to coming up with an assessment system. Besides, if the order about the assessment has been taken in 2021 and been approved, that means we're lagging behind in implementation. We still don't have a mechanism of assessment of these achievements. And the Ministry of Education already set a task for us of monitoring these actions. Now, if we are to speak about lifelong learning, then the next issue is organizing a TVE system for persons with special educational needs. It's also an important issue. We don't have parameters of their employment, and in the Republic of Kazakhstan, we don't have a relevant classification of their professions, considering the principles and criteria for the selection of recommended types of specific profession and the exclusions of professions that are contraindicated from a medical point of view, and approaches to professional orientation in professional organization. It's another serious task that we have to solve. And in order to solve these issues, what we suggest, and that's only part, of course, because if we speak overall about the system of education for children with disabilities, we wouldn't be able within this conference to talk about all of the issues that have to do with preschool and young age. So we only talk about school age here and partially the professional education. We believe that it's important to improve the legal and regulatory framework for the quality of education of children with disabilities. And we need to we need a legal and regulatory framework in the development and implementation of these legal and regulatory documents that would manage the quality of special education. We also need to develop and implement management and audit the quality of special education. We need to have quality mechanisms for managing education. Of course, you can't solve these issues without scientific evidence. And we need to develop a mechanism and national criteria for assessment of education and develop a toolbox for objective assessment and criteria for assessing organizations and education, because there are controversies in these criteria. They're more for mainstream schools, and special schools are outside of these criteria. We need to conduct applied research to assess the quality of special conditions for education. And we also need tools for assessing the quality of education with children with disabilities. And of course, all of that needs to be done from a position of innovative technologies, so innovative tools. And it's a big work we have ahead of us. And we need here cooperation with scientists and practitioners and all the organizations that are involved in teaching children with disabilities. It is clear that the assessment of quality is a serious issue, and everybody has different visions and opinions about that. It triggers a lot of debate, and the truth is born in debate. So we have one goal, though, to provide quality for education for children with disabilities. So that's briefly it. Briefly, that's the content of my presentation. Thank you very much, Ms. Eigel, for this methodically structured speech. and a seriously conducted analysis of the legal and regulatory framework of the education organization system. And I'd like to say that we are now drawing a conclusion to our session. Of course, we fell behind schedule, but I'd just like to say that speaking of needs assessment and creating the environment, I'd like to say that in the law, which has been approved in June 26 on making amendments to certain legal acts due to related to inclusive education, they have a norm of this to consider an administrative violation, the non-creation of an special environment, the right environment for children with special education needs, not only children with disabilities. And this is the requirement that which is then followed by all the issues that need to be solved. So why would only the school principal be responsible for not creating this environment? And so I'd like to tell you that speaking about the quality of education today, what quality of education can we speak of when in Kazakhstan over 3,000 special classes with mental retardation, with intellectual impairments are. Why I'm talking about intellectual impairment is because before, the people with mild mental retardation used to go to special schools, but due to the deinstitutionalization, the children with mild intellectual impairments go to mainstream schools. So they're not taught, they're not homeschooled, they're not in special institutions. They, as research shows, 72% in special schools are children with mild disabilities, with moderate disabilities. What about the ones with mild disabilities? They're all in the mainstream schools, that means then. Are there special classes for them there? And it's a big issue. And I'd like to say that there can be no quality of education if throughout all the years, not a single mainstream school having special classes bought not a single textbook, didn't buy a single textbook for children with intellectual impairments and so forth. That's what we're talking about. So this is a serious requirement, and I'd like to say that probably the Ministry of Education, the key decision makers who determine political will, would have to study the presentations of our speakers, because all of these issues are of systemic nature. And preparing for this conference, we actually wanted to get the expected result. And the expected result for us is that those suggestions in those analytical issues that our speakers voiced, that the representatives of the government should listen to that carefully, and made it so that, as I said in my speech already, and in my welcome speech and in my speech, that the pre-requirements for inclusive education is that the Ministry of Education should become should order scientific research and procure scientific research, and be careful about who they issue grants to, and to the content of research, mostly performed by PhDs. And I would like to call and urge you to study the materials presented at this conference especially the presentations was today. Now, I'm thinking that unfortunately we're falling behind schedule. We're 20 minutes behind. So I announce a break. Oh, before we announce the break, Asia Oktanova has asked to speak, the president of the Association of.
Я хочу от имени
On behalf of, I would like to give you best wishes on behalf of those who you dedicated your life to, the parents and their children with disabilities. Now, this is a congratulatory passport. I'm representing the Association of Parents of Children with Disabilities. Your SATR gives us access to new technologies, modern rehabilitation equipment. Your contribution to special education in Kazakhstan is indeed invaluable. Rosa Janovna, you're a leader, you're an innovator, you change the lives of our children for the better. You are the on behalf of RD, I would like to wish you great health, prosperity, new achievements, and the well-being for all your family. And the 25th anniversary of Sutter for invaluable contribution to the development of new technologies, education, provision textbooks, improving quality of people with disabilities. And this was done by this was made by our workshop Special Art. Children make it. This picture is called Revival because lizard is a symbol of revival. Rosa Ajanovna, no matter what difficulties you encounter, we wish that you revive, that you get again on your feet. Thank you very much. This is the recognition by parents is the best award someone could receive, someone could have. Now let us break, and our next session the final session. The next fourth session is our final session, and hopefully this session will be joined not only by pedagogues but also by rehabilitologists, by physicians who select equipment, rehabilitation equipment, and who deal with rehabilitation of children, especially developing environment, sensory, and compensatory equipment. So we start our next session at 2:30. And I hope you will like the presentations, just that these presentations are as good as previous ones. See you after lunch.